All right, Iboga in the brain. This picture is quite fitting. One of the things you'll find if you go to Gabon is there's this expression they have of breaking the brain. And what they say sometimes is that for the Westerner, you have to break the mind. And if you're curious on what that means, there's a really beautiful book called Dispelling Watiko. And in the book, I think it's Paul Levy, I believe is the author. But in the book, they talk about this parasite that exists in the mind of the Westerner specifically. And when I first heard that in Africa, I couldn't help but think of the correlation to this concept of Watiko, which many indigenous people sort of spoke about when the Westerners started showing up. And they say that Watiko is this insatiable thirst, this never-ending desire for more, this need to constantly consume. And I just felt like this was a pretty good representation of sometimes what Iboga to feel like. So we'll do an intro to Iboga and Ibogaine. We'll talk about the Bwiti people a little bit, just so we always root ourselves in the tradition. Um, and then we'll get into some science, and then we'll jump into a little chat with Jodie. At the end, we'll have some time for questions. So most of y'all know Iboga is derived from a tree that grows in Gabon, the Tabernacle Iboga tree. It's obviously native to Central Africa, mainly Gabon, but it also grows in the Cameroon, Congo. I know a woman who said it was all the way up in Burkina Faso as well, and a few other places. So it's grown all over. We have it growing here in the jungles of Costa Rica as well. So it grows all over the place. It grows under tree shade mostly. We have some that are planted a little bit too far in the sun and they're small, and we have ones under the tree shade and they're pretty massive already. In August, we'll be going, Joe and I will be going to a friend of ours who have 3,000 planted in Colombia, getting some seeds of a few different varieties and be able to come plant those here. So it's pretty exciting. Some of the science says that there's about 12 different alkaloids, which most of the people know of Ibogaine. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then, of course, the indigenous people who are the trusted bearers of Iboga are the Bwiti people. Um, a few of us on this call have been initiated in Africa. And so if anyone has any questions, feel free, especially if you're a female. There's a few females here who've been initiated in Gabon. And then I just like to mention we have a nonprofit, 501 organization registered in California. And right now, what we're doing is a project to rebuild Mama Toto's village. This is here, her with Joe, a photo from their initiation. And the plan after getting her village rebuilt is to, sorry, the slide is crazy. After getting her village rebuilt is to start an initiative where we take women from prison, especially women of color, before they get re-released back into society, fund them to come to Africa to do an initiation, and then to come back and sort of have a nice reboot before they get started. So if you do ever feel called to donate, especially around tax season, please feel free. Again, it's all tax deductible donations. So, what is Iboga versus Ibogaine? This is a big question people have. They sort of use the two interchangeably, but you really can't. One way to think about it is Ibogaine is like the color red, and Iboga is the entire rainbow. Ibogaine is a single alkaloid. These are nitrogen-containing compounds. Serotonin is another example of an alkaloid. So is caffeine. These are very common ones we're sort of used to. And Ibogaine is the most known psychoactive compound inside of Iboga. It's the most researched. And we'll talk about some of the other ones here in this presentation. One of the beautiful parts about working with Iboga and Ibogaine specifically is the amount of receptors it binds to across the brain. If anyone's ever worked with SSRIs, for example, you're talking about just binding to the serotonin receptors. If you've ever gone to a ketamine clinic, you're talking about binding to the glutamate receptor system. Um, you know, one thing that's fascinating is it almost acts like a full spectrum medicine in true in full transparency, and it really is a medicine for the human brain, for the mind. I've never really heard of anything or seen anything that has such a approach in the way it binds the receptors across the brain, and what it does. And we'll talk about that a little more. We'll move through each receptor. I won't spend too much time. You'll see here, I always like putting the white papers with the DOIs. If you don't know what a DOI is, it's basically like the address of this white paper. So you can find it yourself and read up everything. And so this one's just about Iboga and the opioid receptor system. We all know its anti-addictive properties, and the reason why is it binds to these opioid receptors, helping with withdrawals, helping break addiction, anti-addictive properties. It's actually fascinating for that. So that's something Ibogaine's really known for the most. What people don't know is that ibogaine and tabernantine actually have a higher affinity for these opiate receptors than ibogaine, which in other words, what I'm saying is that there are other alkaloids inside of iboga, the full tree bark, that do a better job with anti-addictive properties. Ibogaine is just the most naturally occurring, so it's the most studied. Um, and most of the ibogaine clinics out there aren't using ibogaine from iboga; they're using ibogaine from a plant called volcanga. And volcanga is a plant that grows annually. You can harvest it more often, and it has a higher yield of ibogaine. And so a lot of the clinics are actually getting it from there. Um, it obviously binds to the sigma receptors. We went over this in our talk about how it has anti-cancerous properties. Without going into too much detail, basically these sigma receptors are responsible for handling the stress that cancer cells go through as they're growing, which is what they do. It's the problem with them. And so what happens is ibogaine has a potential, and so do other alkaloids, to bind to these receptors, therefore making sure that the cancer cells can't adequately handle their stress, and then they go into apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. We have a YouTube video that goes into all the deep science of this if you're interested on our YouTube channel. The dopamine receptor systems, this is one of the reasons why it works for Parkinson's. Actually, this upcoming retreat, we have a gentleman coming who's a former Olympian athlete with Parkinson's. We're doing a case study with him right now. We have a video on our YouTube channel about the deep science of this. What I just want to point out is this area down here, this ventral tegmental, excuse me, and the substantia nigra, these two areas mostly where dopamine starts, and these are the pathways it travels through. What's fascinating about this is Iboga is one of the few things, Ibogaine is one of the few things that gets down here and stimulates these dopamine producing neurons, which is why it works with stuff like Parkinson's, why it helps reset the reward system. This is also why at the retreat I'm so big about taking your phones away, because one of the biggest dopamine hits we get is through technology and cell phone scrolling. And so one thing we encourage people to do is put the phones away because it helps with the full reset of the system. Unfortunately, on waterfall day, people are usually back on their cell phones. Not all. Iboga and the serotonin receptors, again. Um, Serotonin, if you guys know SSRIs, these control our mood, emotions, and help regulate sleep. And so what you're talking about is a mood stabilizer. We go into this in depth in our microdosing video about Iboga, why it's beneficial. This also attributes to why a lot of times there's this glow after Iboga. You basically have a natural SSRI there. It's why microdosing 28 days after helps sort of increase the baseline of the reset of the serotonin system. And again, we talk about that in the microdosing video. The glutamate receptor systems, if you've ever worked with ketamine, these are the receptors that ketamine is binding to. Again, this is sort of just showing how magical Iboga is with all these different receptors it binds to. It's fascinating. Ketamine works with blocking these NMDA receptors, and this is how you disrupt those sort of harmful pathways that have been associated with your depression, your addiction, your chronic pains. And Iboga sort of also antagonizes this receptor system as well. The acetylcholine receptor, if you ever addicted to nicotine, this is the reason why. You have to constantly keep feeding it. And again, it has the potential to bind to that. This is a study done where they basically hooked rats on nicotine and used Ibogaine to basically break that addiction. A lot of the people who come to us for wanting to get off vaping or something have a lot of success afterwards. Microdosing helps a bunch. But there's a story I tell of these two 17-year-old kids I sold medicine to about a year and a half ago, and they've been completely clean ever since. So it definitely helps with nicotine, which is one of the stickiest substances there is. Next thing about Iboga that's fascinating for the brain, this isn't necessarily about the receptors, this is about the brain itself, is these GDNF proteins, which I talk about all the time because they're one of the most fascinating things for me. They're called glial cell line-derived neurotropic factors. They're responsible for neuroplasticity, neuronal repair and growth, and they aid in brain recovery and regeneration. My daughter, Zariah, right now, who's 4 months, she has a massive amount of GDNF proteins in her brain right now. And at the age of 3, that number is going to start to taper off for the rest of her life. After you work with Iboga, Ibogaine, you're going to find an all-time high of this GDNF protein count, and that's accounting weight for weight. In other words, what we're saying is you're putting your your brain in this hyper state of neuroplasticity and repair. This is why it also helps with Parkinson's, because the degeneration of these dopamine producing neurons, these GDNF proteins go in and start to repair them. It's actually fascinating. Another thing that is probably for me the coolest part, and where I've sort of noticed the most long-term benefits of working with Iboga as long as I have constantly, very constantly, I guess I could say, is this myelination promotion that happens. So myelination, so you have your neurons here, and you have this axon of the body that comes all the way down to the axon terminal. What happens is the chemical signal comes up here and it stimulates an action potential. In other words, it creates an electrical charge that travels down the body of this axon into another neuron, which you could think of as right here. What's so fascinating about having this myelination is that myelination is the insulation that allows this or this electrical impulse to stay put, basically to travel through. When this myelination is worn down, the chemical or the electrical signals don't travel from point A to point B. Think about someone with Parkinson's. They want to pick up a book or something and they can't. The idea is there, the thought's there, but the action potential isn't traveling, creating a chemical signal, creating an electrical signal to get down to actually promote the motor function. Well, what's interesting is that Ibogaine, Iboga, is specifically known to help increase the myelination around these neurons. And what's so fascinating about that is that when the myelination grows, you start having these pockets in between. They're called the nodes of Ranvier. And what happens is normally when electrical impulse travels with low insulation, it must travel this entire distance from point A to point B. Let's say you're driving 500 miles, going 100 miles an hour. Yeah. That would take you 5 hours. Yeah. To get from point A to point B. Well, when you have myelination there, like this, what they say happens, you actually jump from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier. And what happens is you travel 100 times faster. And so what you're actually talking about is the difference between reacting to something and responding to something. And if there's one thing I've noticed in my life from working with Iboga, and it sounds silly, is that it became very hard for people to scare me. It sounds weird, but it's almost like when that environmental impulse or stimulation happens, the reaction time in my body is so fast that I'm able to respond to life's event versus react. And that is a liberatory thing right there. And so this is one of the most fascinating things about this. This is also why we serve eggs with cholesterol. This material here, the myelination is made of cholesterol. And so when when doctors are telling you to lower your cholesterol levels and keep dropping them, you're going to see later why that's not necessarily the best thing as long as you're getting it from healthy sources. So like avocado, eggs are great things to do, but this is why we have cholesterol, high cholesterol foods in our diet at the retreats specifically for this. This isn't necessarily related to the brain, but you do have a set of 30,000 neuronal cells in your heart called the intrinsic cardiac nervous system. And so technically your heart has a brain there. So I thought this would be important to put in. And it also explains a lot of stuff about Iboga and Ibogaine in the heart, which I think is nice to sort of speak about here because I don't hear a lot of people talking about this. So the reason why Ibogaine specifically is dangerous for the heart is what happens is it prolongs something called your QT interval. It's the QT is this point right here to this point if you look at an ECG, right? And what's actually happening with the prolonged QT interval, and this is example of it here. This is a normal QT, a prolonged means it's just longer. We won't go through all the steps, but what's actually happening here is in normal conditions, inside of your heart cells, you have a negative charge on the inside and a positive charge on the outside. And through transferring of ions through this HERG channel, these polarities sort of flip. And that allows the polarization and the repolarization of the heart, which keeps your QT interval normal. Well, what happens specifically is Ibogaine and Neuroibogaine bind to this channel, which stop those ions from moving, mainly the potassium ions. And I'll go back a slide. These are the potassium ions. They stop these ions from moving. And because they don't they're not allowed to move, it prolongs your QT. This is why in all the studies, which you'll see, the Stanford study we're going to talk about in a moment, they're serving magnesium with Ibogaine. And the reason is because magnesium helps with the potassium binding right there. And so at our retreats, what we do is we serve sea moss before all the ceremonies. We'll give you a big old spoonful of sea moss. If you've ever had sea moss, it's massively flooded with all the minerals you could possibly need. I think it's like 108 of the 111 minerals there are in sea moss. And so we're actually doing the same thing they do in these clinical settings, just with natural products like sea moss. And so going to the Stanford study, this is the white paper for it, the DOI. If you want to read it yourself, it's fascinating. What they did in the Stanford study, you see it's magnesium, Ibogaine. Now you understand why they're using magnesium. It's also why I have a little electrolyte packets I might give people in the ceremonies too, just to help with all this heart stuff. What they did was they took 30 veterans. These are all special forces folks between the age of 35, 33 and 58, excuse me. And what they did was they measured them pre-treatment, pre-Ibogaine, with a series of tests, clinical assessments. They gave them one treatment of Ibogaine, and then they measured them post, right? And so this is the data they came across. So pre-treatment is the gray. We see that PTSD, depression, anxiety, symptom severity is pretty high. After treatment, 3 days, 1 month, and 6 months, you can see it's almost all but eradicated, gone. And again, remind you, this is just Ibogaine. If you remember earlier, we talked about the serotonin receptors or dopamine receptors. And so you started having an understanding of what's actually happening behind the scenes here, how it can help with mood, right? Depression, anxiety are things directly related to your mood. PTSD is a little more of a tricky one. It needs to be more research as to what the actual mechanisms are, but you could almost attribute these really to the serotonin levels in the brain. The next is moral injury. If anyone doesn't know what moral injury is, it's a big topic right now. It's basically the psychological, social, and spiritual impacts of events where one's deeply held moral beliefs and values are betrayed or violated in high stakes situations. And so you see these moral injury symptom scale also decreased. And if you look at it, it's a pretty substantial drop. And for me, this is probably the one that matters the most. Suicidality, endorsing of suicidal ideation. If you look at it, it went from over 40%, almost 50%, down to almost 0%. If there's anything I can say that's sort of hit me with this is the fact that it's literally saving lives. And we're connected with a few veteran organizations. Jodie's, she'll talk a little bit more later, but one of them is No Fallen Heroes, and Wiz, who is the sort of captain of that ship. He started No Fallen Heroes because of the amount of suicide that was happening in the veteran population. And so for me, this is one of the big ones right here. I mean, just if you just think about that, there's a plant that grows in Africa, you eat its roots, and the idea of suicide sort of goes down. And yes, we're talking about Ibogaine, but remember, you're just talking about the color red. And with Iboga, there's a full spectrum. So you have higher affinity for a lot of the receptors, and the effects that are happening in the brain are happening at a more substantial level with Iboga. My dissertation thesis is designed to do sort of the same study, not with the veteran population, with the regular population, but proving that Iboga has therapeutic effects as well. The next part of the study that's fascinating is that the cortical thickness increased in the study from baseline to 1 month. If you're curious what cortical thickness is, it refers to the measurement of the width of the gray matter in the cerebral cortex. I'll talk about the gray and white matter here in a second. But what's important to notice here is that this is directly correlated to brain development. Neurodegenerative diseases are related to lower cortical thickness. Alzheimer's, schizophrenia are also. This is why there is a case to make that Iboga is a cure for schizophrenia. And the other reason is because one of the models of schizophrenia is called the dopamine model. And what we are taught in the clinical setting is that one of the reasons people are schizophrenic is because they have a dysregulated dopamine transport system. Well, if you remember, Iboga and Ibogaine are one of the few things that actually bind to those receptors deep into those lower limbic parts of the brain. And so you're talking about things that could actually help with schizophrenia. And actually what I want to do is actually use Iboga to work with schizophrenia patients one day. It also is related to cognitive abilities. That's the cortical thickness. And again, thicker equals greater cognitive performance. And so what is this whole thing with white matter, gray matter? And a simple analogy first before we go over it. Think of a city, right? The gray matter are the buildings where all the work happens, right? And these are the offices, the schools, the houses. So that's the gray matter. The white matter are the roads and highways that connect all of these buildings. So people in the terms of the brain, which would be the signals, can move around and get things done. So that's an easy way to sort of understand and rationalize the importance of gray matter and white matter. And this is just a little image showing kind of where these parts are in the brain. Again, this peaks in your middle ages and fully develops in your 20s. And remember from the previous slide is that we're getting increased cortical thickness. In other words, what we're talking about is increase in this gray matter part of the brain. Um, it sounds pretty important if you think about it. This slide was freaking fascinating to me. What they did was they observed all the areas where the relative blood flow changed. And if you think about it, if you've studied any sort of Eastern philosophies, you know that where your blood flows, it's not just blood, it's also prana or life force or chi or whatever you want to call it. And so what they noticed was that all of these specific areas in the brain had increased blood flow after this one session with Ibogaine. Now, I know people say that 10% of your brain is utilized only, which has been debunked. But just think about this for a moment. If you're getting increased blood flow to normally dormant parts of the brain, what you're actually talking about is a higher usage of brain capacity overall. Now, again, that 10% thing isn't true. If someone tells you that, it's BS. But the point is still the same. You're increasing blood flow to these places. Imagine if you had um, a wound or something, or your leg fell asleep, right? What's really happening is you're blocking off the blood flow. Now it's numb. Once you get blood flow back to that part, you can actually use it again. Think about that for your brain now. And so there's all these different regions of the brain. The one that is the most important to me is down this basal ganglia, this habit formation and reward-based learning. But again, here is the left white matter region that had increased blood flow, which makes sense why you have the increase in cortical thickness. You're getting more life force, more energy, more nutrients there. What else? The left amygdala for emotional processing and threat detection. It sounds pretty important place to have some good blood flow. And if you just go down this list, you'll see something. It's just very fascinating. This is why I call it a medicine for the mind. This is also why I tell people in ceremonies, and I sometimes I say this and I feel like I shouldn't. I really don't care about people's ceremonies other than the fact that they get through safe because I know all this is happening. And this is going to affect your life more than a singular transformative experience. You can have the most beautiful visions in the Iboga ceremony, and that's for you. That's great. Like the insights that come from there, but you have to be an active participant in your life afterwards. And what this study is showing is that it's helping you tune your brain to actually do that. And so going back real quick, just I want to touch base on this basal ganglia portion. Um, this is the basal ganglia down here. This part down here. There's multiple of them. Something very fascinating about the basal ganglia that I like to mention is that when you first learn to drive a car, you would imagine that you got behind the steering wheel and you were like, oh shoot. There's the gas pedal, there's these blinkers, there's the key, there's the radio might be on. Like there's so many things happening at once. It's this complex task that's being handled by the sort of outer layer of the brain, right? A very complex task which requires a great amount of concentration, focus, and energy. What about 2 years later? How do you drive a car? If you're like me, you have your knee on the steering wheel, you're texting, you have your favorite song on, and you're like looking at something off in the distance, right? I really don't drive like that, but I'm making a point is that there's this, we don't have to focus on it anymore. So the question is, how does that happen? And the reason that happens is because what happens with the basal ganglia is complex tasks repeated over time get compartmentalized down to the basal ganglia and become sort of these automated processes, right? Some things that we don't have to think about. My specific tenet in why people suffer, my whole philosophy and approach to it is that all that's happening in our lives is our learned suffering behaviors have migrated down to the basal ganglia and have become automated processes that run in the background of our life. So we don't have to think about it to create our own suffering. This is why in that level 2 of our program, we do a super flood dose. It's not just because of some spiritual reasons. Spiritual things happen in the privacy of your own heart. The reason is because I know if I can flood dose you, I'm flooding this basal ganglia region, and that's where you get that big reset, right? And so this last slide is showing you that just one treatment of Ibogaine, you're getting increased blood flow down there, right? And then the dopamine system that all working down here shows that you're also getting Ibogaine down there, Iboga down there, and the various other alkaloids that bind to these receptor systems. And so I just think that's a very important thing to name. This is self-reported disability. This is their limitations due to a disability. You can see that it's decreasing. This is cognition, mobility, self-care, life activities. Basically, all these sort of functions that allow you to have a better life are also going away. And then this one over here is one of the best things that's helped me with school is that your flexibility, your ability to switch from task to task, the cognition, cognitive inhibition, basically the ability to say no. This is why it helps so much with substance issues and processing speeds, active and automated response to stimuli, all increased across the entire veteran population, which is pretty fascinating. And then the last slide, which I think a bunch of people from Los Angeles would really love, since there's this big push on being younger out there specifically, is that the predicted brain age across the entire veteran population got younger by 1.37 years. And mind you, this is one treatment, right? This is not multiple treatments, and it's just Ibogaine. Who knows how much lower it would be with the whole flurry, the slurry of alkaloids present in Ebola rhubarb, held in more of a sacred ceremonial contents, plus noticing this is probably more of a clinical setting. It sort of just shows you what this has the potential to really be. And again, I'm just going to say that the brain got younger. That is fascinating to me and incredibly, incredibly profound. Cool, right on time. So, what I'd like to do now is introduce our guest speaker. Let me stop sharing. There's a button over here. There we go. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Jodie. I'll do a little intro. She's a fourth generation firefighter, military veteran of 25 years. She served in the Air Force. She was a firefighter there and a combat medic. What else? 5 documented concussions, multiple surgeries at Walter Reed. She'll talk about some of that. And retired medically after Army injury. And most probably importantly, she's a proud mom. I was honored to meet Jodie in Sedona, where she came to one of our workshops. And yeah, just a really lovely soul. And yeah, we want to give you some space here to introduce yourself. And so, Jodie, I'd love to ask, yeah, like tell us about how you, like, why is it that you became, why did you join the military? Like, what brought you to that? What was your childhood like?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Even just watching this, I'm still processing everything that you just put up there. That was amazing. And thank you, not only for having me, but doing what you do, because it is such remarkable work. And almost everything that you just showed, I'm sitting there like mentally checking boxes, man. It was like bossy moments, really nailed it. So, a little bit about me. I grew up in Connecticut, really small dot on the map up in New England, and in a typical Irish Catholic family where I feel like I need to full stop right there because there's enough issues and stuff in itself that. But what got me into that was my father, my grandfather, my great grandfather. They were all firefighters and they all served in the military. So it was not only a tremendous honor to walk in their footsteps, but to try to carry out that legacy. So I joined a volunteer fire department at 15 years old and just kind of went from there.
Wow, I didn't know that about the 15-year-old part. I was like, I yeah, I couldn't even imagine doing anything with any type of responsibility at 15. It's
Well, and I probably wasn't, but it was through a junior program that the high school had offered. And, it was partly cool just to get out of school at times, if there was a call that we could respond to. But yeah, you had to stay external until you were 18, and then at 18 you could start being an interior firefighter and doing a lot more hands-on.
Wow. So it was really in the gene pool for you then. And then when you enlisted to the military, was it the Air Force that you got into first? And what
I
was that
did.
like?
I did. I went into the Air Force first as a firefighter. That was the Air National Guard. So I was working full time and then going to the Air National Guard part time. My hope and plan at that time was to do a full 20 in each. I spent 4 years with the Air Force and then transferred into the Army.
And in the Army, can you tell us a little bit about that experience? I mean, a combat medic doesn't sound like it's a very like light walk in the park there.
No, it wasn't by any means, but it also, I looked at it like I was serving my community for so long, doing fire and EMS as a civilian, that there was no greater honor than to serve our own. Um, and Really felt drawn and led to that. And one of my best friends was the pilot in command of this small aviation unit that I had joined, and they were looking for medics and on rotation for deployment, and had the opportunity to fly with him. So it was kind of like a hands down no brainer. Everybody thought I was insane that I was looking to leave the Air Force and go Army. Usually people do it the other way around. But it was an awesome ride. And I think had I not gotten hurt, I would love to have stayed in there as long as possible.
Yeah, and would you mind telling us a little about the injuries, sort of that side of it, what that experience was like for you?
Yeah. So I landed wrong. It was a routine training that I had, and I landed wrong and dislocated my knee laterally. So, like what the doctor said was like internal derangement, which could be applicable for me in many ways. But for my knee, I basically tore all the soft tissue, the tendons, the ligaments, the muscles. There was even bone contusions. So I spent a few years at Walter Reed in like limb salvage. Essentially, there was six total surgeries. Five of them were total knee revisions, and then it got to a point where they just said that I'm running out of options, and they were either down to a complicated total knee replacement or above the knee amputation, which neither one of them anybody really wanted to entertain at that point. So that essentially led to my retirement. I was put through a medical and physical and medical evaluation board. So they found me non-retainable, non-deployable, and sent me through that process of the retirement board, which was kind of like that catalyst of what it ripped a proverbial bandage essentially off of all these underlying issues, right? I think, and we talked before too, I used essentially work as my vice, you know, to just stay busy and focus on everybody else's emergencies. I didn't have time to deal with my own. So
And psychologically speaking, do you mind if I ask, what was your military experience like, and how was it once you left, not having that vice, that bandage anymore?
that was difficult. Honestly, I don't feel like I transitioned very well at all. And they have all these remarkable programs for you, to assist you in that process. But it's kind of like drinking water from a fire hydrant. You don't know what you're going to need until you're out, and then you just, whether you take notes or not, you can't retain all of that. So not having work as that vice anymore, I kind of had to face the music, and it was overwhelming. To try to process and work through things that you didn't even realize affected you or triggered you until you had these things happen.
Yeah.
So.
And in your personal life, I mean, outside of the military, did you have support around you? Did you have resources? Like what'd you do when you got overwhelmed? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think over the years, you really learn to internalize and compartmentalize a lot, especially in our field. Um, you're there for each other, but you're trying to stay strong for one another. So we had this amazing camaraderie and brotherhood, but I also looked at it from my perspective. I can't speak on anybody else's behalf, but back then, I mean, I was a female in a predominantly male environment, right? So the last thing I ever wanted to do was to be that girl essentially that's, showing all this emotion or being dramatic or anything. So I learned to internalize everything and thought that I just needed to stay tough, for everybody else. Um, so we had our own support groups, and a lot of times too they would have debriefing classes for us if there was a rough call or we were going through something. But it was a different time back then. So drinking became a coping vice or mechanism, and the effects that it kind of has on you, you start to you don't recognize yourself really anymore.
Yeah.
You're not the best version of you. But so that was kind of like what led into going in that route, doing a lot of I eventually, I should back up, was command referred during this time, the process at Walter Reed and getting discharged. They saw a rapid decline in my morale. I was always very outgoing and fun. That was also part of my coping mechanism. Even nicknames and stuff. I was always kind of like the jackass of the bunch, and I used comedy. And you kind of have to have a sick sense of humor in that world. But they saw a rapid decline in my morale, so I was command referred to behavioral health.
Mm.
And to be honest with you, I think it's great that it's there, but it's also I thought very counterproductive in some ways. We talked about the different modalities and CBT and DBT and IFS and like all these things. So even like exposure treatment therapy is in my mind barbaric. It keeps you in that mindset. You're just constantly stuck in the trauma and the thick of it. So um, we tried to check all those boxes, and meds, of course, was one of the first things that they suggest and recommend too. And if I could just say, like, no more big pharma, it's killing us. Um,
Yeah.
and truly doing a disservice to veterans and first responders. So,
Yeah. And how did you, I guess, how did you find Iboga and the path of working with plant medicines? I'm also going to use the word psychedelics as well, but
yeah.
yeah, I'm curious, how did you get sort of pushed towards that avenue?
So after trying so many different things and it not working, I want to almost say like Iboga made it happen. Iboga called. Um, I felt like something had to give, and the only thing that was giving at that time was me. And I was by the time I kind of came into your circle, I felt like I was hanging on by a thread. So I just started really deep diving into more natural, holistic approaches, doing a lot of podcasts, a lot of YouTube videos, and it's like a rabbit hole of stuff, and this is all very new to me, so it was a little overwhelming at first. I didn't know the difference of, what did what, and was looking into medical marijuana and psilocybin, and it just kind of trickled down into the Iboga world. And one of the podcasts that I had found was Wiz Buckley's No Fallen Heroes, and that led me to Nicole, our little fox, our sweet fox. Um, and even talking with her, I didn't know which way to go. The psilocybin journey, everything had, great promising, read ups or something. And there was something about Iboga. And it was when I read that it was the seeker of truth. And that was kind of like the spot there. It was channeling feminine energy and all of these things that it was just like, this is exactly what I need.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, just for context for everybody, that in two different origin stories, the first people to ever ingest Iboga were women. And one of the root traditions is actually a more feminine tradition. So it has this reputation of being very masculine, but if you've sat with us, you'll find a very soft, feminine led container. And it really does speak to me and more honesty about what Iboga really is than anything else. And yeah, we call it the hunter of the truth.
Yeah.
And can you share a little bit about your experience of working with Iboga so that we can get an idea like what that was like for you?
Yeah. It's still, I've thought about this since I left, and it's still by far the most transformative experience of my life. It was so beautiful in every aspect and regard. And I had no idea what to expect. I've never done anything like this. And I remember even talking to you, and before we started, you said, "Hey, with the TBI, we're going to do a little extra." So like there was that split second of a pucker factor, of like, oh, I didn't know what we were going to do. But the experience itself, I felt almost like our bedroll was kind of, it was starting to go with the music. Like I felt like this rhythm, and eventually that led to almost like this visionary of floating, and I was kind of floating down a stream, and it opened up into this like vast room of darkness, but what I think now was stars. It was just, everything was just speckled with these beautiful lights. And um eventually I started to see this like horizontal slide reel, almost like an old fashioned movie reel, like a camera reel. And there was two separate piles of what looked to be pictures. And in the left side, it was just kind of like rapid fire of pictures that were just kind of like dumping. And I was getting frustrated initially because I couldn't focus on what it was. And to the right side was another pile, and that would kind of slow up, and you would kind of be able to focus in on things. And then the other one was coming. So I didn't know which way to really focus, but it was people that I knew, people that I worked with. It was all good events, good people, good memories. Um, and I started to feel like this sense of peace, and I guess like a self reflection of, this was part of my life. This was all my life. And I'm focused and I'm stuck in all of this hurt and pain and grief and suffering. And I have a choice. And and why am I stuck? So I'm having like an internal dialect with myself, and seeing all these things. And then I remember even talking with you, I think it was the second ceremony, and we were talking about acceptance is everything, right? And suffering is optional. And it was just like all of that internalization and compartmentalization. It was like Iboga blew the doors off of all of that. And it was like, this doesn't serve you. All of this stuff no longer serves you. And these things were also part of you and who you are. Don't forget about that. Um, so it was an amazing experience. I felt too like everything was alive. There was no limits, there was no boundaries. Everything was just open. And I felt like that everything that I had seen, even I would take the mask off every now and then, and we had the plants up above us in the yoga studio. And it felt like the plants were even alive, you know? And the we had Mexican blankets on us. So they have like these Aztec symbols and like they were dancing. Like everything was just alive and energy. And um it made me feel like we were all part of that. We were all part of oneness and alive and energy together. Um, it was wild. It was beautiful because initially I was really nervous. I didn't know what I was going to face or see, and it was all good. It was so good. Uh,
I really love the way you frame that because, one of the things we talk about is the difference between healing and remembering,
mm,
right? Whereas healing implies a lack of wholeness and remembering implies that it's always been whole, you've just forgotten. And I think what you sort of just articulated is exactly our entire stance of working with Iboga. It's about remembering the beauty of life as well, too. You don't have to use it to go and dig into the trauma. You can use it to remember how beautiful life is and take that out of the experience with you and implant that into your heart as a seed and let that thing grow over time. So yeah, I just want to thank you for sharing that. And if you were to sort of look at yourself before and after, what would you say has shifted in your life since that experience with the wood?
I honestly I feel like even in the presentation that you gave tonight, I feel like I resonated with so much of that mentally, physically, and spiritually. I feel like a new person again. And I know, we talk about the term healing, and you said, that means that you're not whole. But I honestly feel like Iboga made me whole again. Um, I feel a sense of liberation again. There was times, that it was cyclical of the depression and the anxiety and the heaviness of all of it, and all of that feels like it's gone. I had significant issues with nightmares in the past, flashbacks, and sometimes these things that would trigger me that I wouldn't even know was a trigger until it happened. And something that I was so excited to share with you that really hits on this. One of those triggers for me was jet fuel, the smell of jet fuel. And I worked on a flight line for a long time, never bothered me. But what I didn't realize is after working in ground zero, we were covered in it. And it wasn't until later on in life I was on a tarmac and I smelled jet fuel and I had my first anxiety attack. So post retreat, I'm back home and you're settling in, and I was across the street from a hospital and they had a life flight come in, and I smelled the jet fuel and I had no reaction. And I remember I cried. My girlfriend was with me and I had to share that moment with her. She didn't even know that I went on the retreat. Um, Told her all about it and how much that it changed my life incredibly. Um, and in some regard too, and I got to find a better way of how to say this, but my faith, I don't, I was raised Catholic. I rebaptized Christian, and faith is having the hope in something positive, right, or better to come. I don't have that anymore. Like I feel like I I feel it. It's around me. It's around all of us. And so like when I share that and I'm like, oh, I lost my faith, everybody's like,
Yeah.
but it's so good. It's like one of those things that once you see and know, you can't not know anymore. You can't unsee that.
But see, I have a saying I go by. It says, experience transcends faith.
Yes,
You can have faith in something all you need, but once you experience that, you don't need the faith anymore.
that's right.
I really appreciate you naming that. I think one of the things with Ebola is yes, it's a medicine of experience. It's experiential. and that stays with you. And you can't, like the truth, you can't unsee the truth once you see it,
Right.
which is a gift.
Right.
And I know I want to share that when we were trying to get before and after MRIs as well. But we had some discrepancy in the type of MRI taken before and after, so we couldn't do a true comparative analysis. But I think your testament of this sort of speaks to what we probably would have saw itself.
For sure. And I would even love to go back through records and get you some of the old MRIs that we had, to see if that would show too. But even from what your doctor had said, it's a clear image, right?
Yeah,
So even if it wasn't the same pre or post, and that was just crazy beautiful and ironic in itself, is that I had another concussion just weeks before our retreat, you know
yeah,
so to be able to do that, but totally
yeah. And
totally
for context for everybody, we have Dr. Hagen, who's our medical advisor in charge of our research initiative. He's helping me design all the different research we're doing with Iboga, and he looked at Jodie's MRI after and is completely clean. We couldn't compare it to her old one. There's a little bit difference there. So, like in terms of case study, people would be able to poke holes in that. We can't do it. But in terms of the actual results of the MRI, it was crystal clear, which means there's no TBI there, which sort of correlates to the Nolan Williams study we just went over, which is, excuse my French, is fucking amazing. And congratulations to you, honestly, for that. You deserve that.
no, thank you
Yeah.
for making that happen. And Iboga Dibote.
Devotee, well, to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us, Jody. And um, yeah, I just want to say too, just from me to you, I just appreciate, um, yeah, just the fact that you came through this bloodline of people who are serving others and you sort of decided to give your life to that, despite what it's sort of taken to you. I'm glad you got your life back in your hands. It's really beautiful to see.
Thank you so much. And thank you for doing what you do and making that possible. I seriously, I cannot thank you and Joe enough for the works that you do.
It takes a whole community. So you're welcome on behalf of everybody's part.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye. See to that.